See, look, I got a Christmas tree, lights up and everything. Here it is. Let's get in the spirit. I'm festive, goddammit. I'm festive. White Noise is a 2022 film directed by Greta Gerwig's partner Noah Baumbach. It's a slight departure from him in general because it's actually the first movie that he didn't actually write himself. It's based on a 1985 novel by Don DeLillo. Probably owing to his success in Marriage Story, this is the first one where he has a significant budget as well. It stars Adam Driver and Greta Gerwig as a married couple that goes through roughly about a year of their life. In particular, I want to focus on the second half where a gaseous cloud forms, which can be considered very toxic, as Adam Driver discovers when he inhales some of it. And he's told he has about 15 years to live. So facing like the existential crisis of potential death, conspiracy theories running amok about this kind of stuff. These conspiracy theorists, which end up hurting people rather than helping them, are not helped by the fact that our governments and experts don't have a consistent message or track record of how to help these people, which helps, exacerbate this kind of thinking. There's mass swearing and folks questioning the severity of all this while things try to go back to normal very, very quickly, almost at an alarmingly fast rate. And this is COVID, right? This is very COVID-pilled. This isn't obviously very one-to-one. I mean, the novel was released in 1980s, and obviously while there are other dystopic threats that this could be analogous to, a lot of it was a criticism of consumer culture as well as a lot of other things. It's a very dense novel. People said it was unfilmable before this. At the same time, there's a lot of allusions to the pandemic you can make in this. And it's not just that, these existential crisis and fear of our own mortality makes people start to question how they will handle the end of the world by the end of the day. Even with this crisis coming about, it eventually quickly dissipates, but what will happen with the next one? Again, very COVID-pilled, even though that did not feel very quick. And these are all very good questions, and it reminds me of another movie. Stop me if you've heard this one before. The 2021 film that was released roughly around Christmas time. All-star cast, stacked to the helm. It deals with the end of the world. Not just that, but explores how humans are at the epicenter of our own destruction. It also looks at class disparity and how certain other classes are held and protected on a very big standard compared to other lower ones, and they have a much easier ride. It's a big metaphor for climate change, but it came out around COVID, so it's easy to leapfrog from one to t'other. Ends with, spoilers by the way, everybody dying in this bleak and frankly rather dispiriting message at the end, and it's very pointed. Well, did you guess it? Dystopic movies, they've never really gone away, but they have come in certain phases. And it's come to my attention, these two movies, and some other one, I think it's about a comet or something, they have been released around Christmas time. One of them is actually about Christmas. It's set on Christmas. This doesn't appear to have stopped. As a Jodie Comer film, The End We Start From, has come out early December in the US. So, more fun, devastating destruction during the holiday season. Why is that? Why have we become so fixated on the end of the world during the most wonderful time of the year? And is this reflective of the mental fry we find ourselves in? Well, to dissect this vague trend, I've noticed, first, we have to invent the Christmas special. Merry Christmas, movie house! Okay, so, if I wore this for the entire video, it would drive me insane, and it's way smaller than I thought it would end up being when I bought it. There's a string thing at the end, but it doesn't really help because my head is enormous. So, I'm sorry if you're expecting me to wear this whole thing, but in order to keep up with continuity, fiction has always been an important part of Christmas. Back to what you call the first ever special, most famous Christmas stories of all time, A Christmas Carol. One that purportedly saved Christmas as we know it. And there have been Christmas movies as long as there have been movies. The oldest Christmas movie is one called Santa Claus, which was a George Albert Smith film that was released in 1898. And it's only barely over a minute long. I got it from a website that tracks the 8 oldest Christmas films ever made. And in roughly over the space of 12 years, rather hilariously, there are 3 fucking Christmas Carol adaptations. This has never gone away. Interesting enough, you start to see more Christmas movies coming out more prominently in the post-war years, if you notice from this other website I found, which tracks apparently every Christmas movie ever made, nearly. Why this started occurring, I have no idea. There is sort of a shift in the post-war years, according to some readings into this, that kind of, moved Christmas towards the more glossy, light-tinted spectacle it ended up becoming. And this was after, this is after World War II, so this could have led to more Christmas movies being produced by Hollywood. However, Christmas movies at the time were tailored more for adults, and They had more of an anti-capitalist leaning to them in a country still recovering from the Wall Street crash. One of the most obvious examples is celebrated Christmas staple, It's a Wonderful Life.
The film centers on two bankers, George Bailey, Jimmy Stewart, and Mr. Potter, Lionel Barrymore, in an American populist twist on the 1843 Charles Dickens novel A Christmas Carol. While Dickens follows the story of the wealthy miser Scrooge experiencing a moralizing evening with three ghosts who show him that the value of life is not monetary, Capra's American reimagining is told from the perspective of Bob Cratchit's Scrooge, underpaid and underappreciated clerk. Capra's reinvention, which pits George Bailey, Cratchit, against Potter, Scrooge, taps into major currents in post-war American culture. As Janine Vassenger writes in her 1986 The It's a Wonderful Life book, which catalogs the film's creation and legacy, after the Great Depression and World War II, many Americans distrusted big banks and saw in Potter the threat of a monopolizing financial power in the average small American town. Capra's post-war spin on Dickens focuses on the empowerment of George Bailey and raises him out of his financial difficulties by giving him the divine intervention to realize his own strengths, where Dickens' novel uses supernatural intervention to show Scrooge his own weaknesses. This new version of A Christmas Carol not only reflected post-Depression American sentiments towards banks, but also constituted a cinematic post-war resolution by acknowledging that distress while maintaining a capitalist message by having a more sympathetic banker, George Bailey, triumphed in the end.
Already, before the Christmas special is up and running, we're getting a subversion of sorts against these Dickensian origins of the spirit of the holidays. I bring this up to make a probably obvious point, but that Christmas films very focally reflect the era on when they were made. And of course, rather famously, It's a Wonderful Life was not an immediate success or an instant Christmas classic. And because it lapsed into the public domain, it was picked up by certain television networks as an easy slot to fill in for time during Christmas. Back in the day, Christmas was more about, spending time with the family sitting at home. You're not really dragging your ass out to the local cinema to watch these movies where you could do it at home. The invention of television changed completely what it meant for a Christmas special to become a staple of certain households and certain people's lives. While different styles of Christmas specials came about in various different ways, one of the most important ones is animation. And this has a lot to do with the fact that animation studios and animators saw the potential that television could offer them to gain more independence in comparison to working with the Hollywood system.
Television was seen as a possible area for expansion and growth. The Hollywood film industry owned or controlled many of the successful animation studios who made product for the theatrically released cartoon shorts. Animators broke off from these studio animation factories and began their own independent companies, which were looking for work. It was this explosion of output in the 60s and 70s and 80s which brought original animation and animated series to television.
So with this expansion route, we started to get Christmas specials that were animated, starting with Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol in 1962. Following this, a Charlie Brown Christmas and Rankin Bass specials. Well, I don't agree with this view on animation, and trust me, this was a stereotype that wasn't where the art form started. Animation is seen as children's entertainment, and because of that, Christmas specials began to be catered to children as such, even though, they are also watched a lot by adults. So we get saccharine aesthetics, simple messages, very much a contrast of the Christmas movies we were seeing in the 40s, and, that's kind of lame, right? That's kind of corny. You can see how people were turned off by this kind of more sincere and hopeful messaging in that was permeating these kinds of specials and this entertainment. Some obvious outliers for the push for this are the mouse and the boomers.
This shift towards children as consumers was something few Hollywood studios were equipped to handle. However, Walt Disney Productions was an outlier. Since the 1920s, Disney recognized the potential of children's media, and as the baby boomer generation, born between 1946 and 1964, grew up throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Disney company dominated the children's market. The baby boom completely altered the demographics of the US, where 2.3 million babies were born each year in the mid 1930s, 3.8 million were born in 1947 alone, and over 4 million every year from 1954 to 1963. By 1964, this population increase resulted in 40% of the US population being under the age of 20. In addition to the baby boom, entertainment began changing in the 1950s. Hollywood experienced declining ticket sales throughout the 1950s, with weekly ticket sales dropping from 90 million in 1946 to 60 million in 1950 and to 40 million in 1960, bottoming out in one data set's estimation at 60 million weekly sales in 1971. Hollywood's crisis in this period owed to many factors, but the most influential was the rise of television. As the youngest families moved into the suburbs throughout the 1950s and away from the cities where most cinema were located, they also benefited from the post-war economy. As their wealth increased, families were able to purchase televisions, resulting in nearly 90% of American homes owning at least one television by 1959. The turn towards children as Christmas viewers in the context of the baby boom, the decline of box office sales, and the rise of television popularity resulted in a 2-decade Hollywood departure from producing Christmas films at all, with the subgenre instead shifting to television specials.
I don't think all media made for children talks down to them. In fact, there's a lot of stuff that's catered towards children that wasn't made for my demographic growing up that I watched and I really enjoyed, and I'm sure you do too. But there is a very this is made for kids feel to this material, and this kind of aesthetic became rather insufferable for a lot of people, and this becomes more prevalent as we go into the more cynical and acerbic 80s and 90s. An obvious example of this was the switch for kind of standalone specials into TV shows just doing their own special Christmas episodes. So you have stuff which had more of a cynical edge that was made by, The Simpsons, Family Guy, or South Park. Animation went from signposting the subgenres, for lack of a better term, innocently hopeful nature to something more self-aware and grouchy. This kind of Ouroboros of innocent, hopeful Christmas specials going into more kind of cynical, self-aware stuff for adults is in something that this podcast I'm quoting from mentions. The community episode, Abed's Uncontrollable Christmas, co-written by staff writer and Starburns, Dino Stamatopoulos, who is also the creator of Moral Oral, a show I should probably say something and make a video about sometime if I get an angle. I'd love to talk about it. The show's brilliant. This is a very wry and cynical parody of Rankin Bass specials, down to the entire cast being made in stop motion and the entire episode playing out like that. An earlier precedent of this attitude can actually be seen in the UK rather than the US. One of their market traditions is Christmas specials from sitcoms. This is kept up to this day, though it's more Mrs. Brown's Boy specials for our sins.
Another vital element of Christmas television was the festive edition of a BBC One or ITV sitcom, which, by the late 1970s, was an integral part of the day as much as the boxes of Melty's Newberry Fruits and various adults passing out post-Queen's speech. The format seemed to be set in stone. Opening credits festooned with holly, the theme tune augmented with a choir and a plot involving the boss making a surprise appearance dressed as Santa Claus. Naturally, he would be embraced by the mother-in-law under the mistletoe, the latter having overindulged with cooking sherry, just as Roger, the caddish, i.e. he wears a cravat, sales rep who lives next door makes a surprise appearance, with hilarious consequences.
Well, it's still got a bit of Christmas schmaltz. It shows by necessity kind of keeping up the British acerbic wit, which is one of their best traits. And of course, the more derisive nature took over. One of my favourite Christmas specials is the Blackadder one. And it's one that seems very obvious on the nose now. It's a kind of inverse parody of A Christmas Carol, but I'd it just really works very well, and it's extremely funny if you know the show. Probably the best example of the changing tones and tide of how Christmas specials are presented was in variety shows. Variety is probably one of the oldest Christmas specials. This dates back to stuff like Bob Hope doing USO shows and taping them for radio in the late 40s and eventually on to television in the mid 50s. By the 80s, even the Yanks were getting into the gentle nature ribbing fun.
The 80s were something of a transition point in American TV, with variety series fading fast in popularity and edgier entertainment like MTV and David Letterman's Late Night adding more metatextuality to the mix. Letterman and his band leader, Paul Schaefer, used to celebrate Christmas on their show by recalling one of Cher's old holiday numbers, a gloriously cheesy rendition of Oh Holy Night. They spoke lovingly of the performance, while essentially admitting they thought it was all so very silly.
From self-aware, gentle-natured ribbing to a bit of a more terrifying affair, we get into Christmas horror movies. I'm not going to go into this whole thing because frankly this could be an entire video of itself, but it's a really fun trend if you've noticed it, because there are probably more horror films set on Christmas than on fucking Halloween.
Garbage Day! Huh? No!
If you've ever enjoyed this clip because you too are a fellow of culture or you were alive on the internet in 2007, you have enjoyed something from a Christmas movie. Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2 goes into the exploits of a man, our Garbage Day fellow over here, whose brother went on a murder spree dressed as Santa Claus. Don't worry you've missed out on Part 1 though, because they truncated the first movie into the first half of this movie, but edited down to 40 minutes, which I don't understand why they did this. Like, I watched both of these back to back, and it's literally just the same movie, just cut down. I don't get it. This falls into tradition more celebrated horror fare, like Black Christmas, or kind of more family-friendly vocations, so to speak, like Gremlins, and also, B-movie schlock. But this all comes from a festive place.
Turns out Christmas and horror have always gone hand in hand. Several centuries before the birth of Jesus, early Europeans would celebrate the December solstice by gathering around a Yule log and sharing tales of winter, death, and rebirth. This tradition of swapping ghost stories was one of many pagan traditions co-opted by Christians, lasting well through the days of Victorian England. As Andy Williams famously croons, "There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago." For everyone. Christmas may be touted as a time of family gatherings and piles of presents, but it is also a season of loneliness, grief, and increased suicide rates. As Phoebe Cates morbidly points out in Gremlins, while everybody else is opening up their presents, they are opening up their wrists. For those of us who feel excluded from the collective worship of Christmas, there's definitely a sick relief in watching the holiday play out on screen as even more horribly than it does in our minds.
As this article points out, since the release of 2015's Krampus, we have actually gotten at least one festive horror film or genre movie every year, so this kind of subversive Christmas tradition continues. Speaking of, Die Hard.
I got some bad news for you, Dwayne.
Die Hard as a Christmas movie is an extremely annoying debate I'm sure you have been subjected to, either by a meme or a very tedious Facebook spat. And what's funny is this started over a Slate blurb back in 2007, and even its original author is baffled by this controversy.
Once again, people are logging on for a holiday argument they've had many times before. Is the 1988 action movie Die Hard, in which Bruce Willis fights terrorists in a Los Angeles skyscraper on Christmas Eve, a Christmas movie? Once again, tweets and Facebook posts about whether Die Hard is actually a Christmas movie are spiking. Posts about whether it's original or cool to talk about Die Hard's status as a Christmas movie are also spiking. Recently, I called up Michael Ager, the author of the blurb about Die Hard in the 2007 Slate Post and currently the New Yorker's online culture editor, to ask him how he felt about the monster he'd created. "I wasn't even aware that this had grown into a huge thing," he said. "I had no idea. There's a lot of unintended chaotic effects of online life," Ager said, though he hasn't had to live with some of them because he doesn't spend that much time on Twitter. I was forced to deliver to him the tragic news that Die Hard Christmas discourse has since produced a secondary market for "is it a Christmas movie" takes, where anyone can claim, for likes and shares, that any movie with a Christmas scene or a Christmas-adjacent vibe, usually having to do with coziness or family drama, is actually a Christmas movie.
She then lists like a lot of films being called Christmas films. You wouldn't really call it Christmas films, you get the bit.
After he'd done a Google search and seen the extent of the mess, Agar compared himself to the guy who tosses an apple core over his shoulder, then comes back to the same spot years later to find a full-grown tree. Minutes later, he emailed me to correct the metaphor. I'm the guy that threw a cigarette out the window and accidentally burned down the forest.
So obviously this is hyperbolic for a comedic intent, but at the same time, yeah, this is a meme that just will not fucking die despite my will. But this illustrates my point that there's a hunger for Christmas entertainment that isn't the typical schmaltz that people were used to. And here's my hot take at the end of this part. I don't give a fuck what you watch during Christmas. It doesn't have to be Christmas theme or festive. Hell, I watch The Wizard of Oz every year because it used to be on like New Year's roughly when I was a kid, and I just associated with Christmas. It's not even remotely Christmas, but I'm not going to stop watching it. Like, people watch Willy Wonka, and that movie ain't very fucking Christmassy. It's more important the feeling they evoke within you rather than the tone or the subject matter or the feel or any of that crap. So if you want something more cynical or edgy or darker, more's the party. No weird, miserly, proto-Christmas person is going to make me stop watching a Blackadder special every year. So that's Christmas specials. Let's look at the Dystopic flicks.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
This one will hopefully be shorter. In fact, I know a guy who talked about this really recently. Kyle Colgrin? Who knows? Watch him though. To make another obvious point, to add on to another obvious point, like Christmas films, apocalypse movies are reflective of the culture that they were made in. Like, cinema in general is, influenced by this whole culture yoke. The nuclear annihilation movie of the 50s, believe it or not, is a lot more positive than you would expect, especially being so close to World War II.
The most pessimistic theme of the 50s science fiction films represent the fear that nuclear bombs will blow up the Earth, yet most of the films also express optimism about survival. Some films suggest redemption, usually Christian in character.
This essay goes into a lot of factors that contribute to the success of nuclear war films. A lot of them have anti-communist sentiments, for example, but one of the big things was the fact that, people had a lot of interest in nuclear fallout after the invention of the atomic bomb. Interestingly enough, a movie that Kyle mentioned in his video was a 1959 film that was made by Stanley Kramer called On the Beach. And it bombed. I'm sorry, I literally wrote it in the script like this. I didn't realize how it sounded. I don't know. Why did I write it like that? It didn't do well, and it was actually heavily criticized for being an unrealistic, defeatist look at nuclear fallout.
Correct, prophetic, technically outstanding. The film was unsettling and controversial, Kramer said. I only hope that the emotional impact of what we're presenting would convince people that we're damn well better do something to assure our survival. Nonetheless, the film lost $700,000, which Variety attributes to its preachy quality. The Mirror News, in a story about the disputes over On the Beach, reported that the Senator Wally Bennis of Utah spoke against the film in Congress, saying, "In my opinion, it paints a distorted picture of what the nuclear war probably would be like." The head of the New York State Civil Defense, Lieutenant General Clarence R. Huber, said that the film does not do justice to the theory that there's relative simple defense against radioactive fallout, and in the end of the war, as pictured, is not inevitable.
This was 1959. By 1964, well, I guess people's minds changed. Yeah, you can't really talk about dystopic movies, especially ones about nuclear fallout, without talking about Dr. Strangelove. It's like one of the quintessential films on this topic. People actually compare it a lot to Don't Look Up, but I would say Strangelove is more punching up than it would be punching all over the place. Its target is more focused on the self-interested men we put all this power to kill us all into, and why that may lead to our downfall. Now, this is present in Don't Look Up, but the framing of it seems to be more interested not so much in the ignorance of these people, but more their caught in bureaucratical nonsense and their own personal biases. I do love them constantly talking about comedies and then sitting with a former Nazi. It's great, and Kubrick thought the best way to tell the story was to make it a comedy.
It was a turbulent time in American history. John F. Kennedy's assassination had occurred only 2 months prior, and just a year before that, in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. This crisis was part of a broader confrontation between these two superpowers, known as the Cold War, when the people of the United States of America were being whipped regularly into a frenzy of anti-communist paranoia through the use of propaganda. Times were tense for the American public in the years leading up to Dr. Strangelove's release. In response, Stanley Kubrick directed, produced, and wrote Dr. Strangelove to illuminate, through the use of satire, the fears, realities, and anxieties of being alive during the Cold War from a Western perspective. Stanley Kubrick had initially intended for the film to be a serious drama. His explanation for changing the approach to the film and its characters was that nuclear war was too outrageous, too fantastic to be treated in any conventional manner, that he could only see it as some kind of hideous joke. Perhaps he didn't have enough sane pride. That's right, I'm doing the Vegeta voice, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So, the culture shifted from hope that our nations could handle this stuff to doubt that, how the fuck could they possibly do that? As tensions ratcheted up during the Cold War in the 80s, our nuclear fiction became a lot bleaker. Over in the UK, we had Tread, which was one of the most famous examples of this response to our paranoia.
Threads was born out of an era of paranoia, the early 1980s. In 1983, U.S. President Ronald Reagan had launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, a program designed to develop an anti-ballistic missile system to fend off a nuclear attack. In the same year, Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. As tensions escalated between the U.S. and the USSR, so speculation fomented that nuclear war was not so much a far-off nightmare as it was an imminent possibility. Historians now compare those days of 1983 to the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 decades earlier as one of the most perilous episodes of the Cold War. Overcome by a sense of urgency, Jackson, then a documentary maker at the BBC, first set about producing an episode for science series QED entitled A Guide to Armageddon. Jackson describes it as an unbiased, factual, emotionless piece of television that asked the simple question, what would happen to us in the event of a nuclear fallout? While viewers who caught A Guide to Armageddon may have well felt a sense of unease, it would little prepare them for Jackson's next project, given the green light in late 1983.
Another frightening British apocalyptic drama was Where the Wind Blows, which is based on a comic that was done by Raymond Briggs, who is the creator of the very famous Christmas special, The Snowman. If you've never seen it, it follows an old couple as they very desperately try to follow governmental regulation after an atomic bomb hits the United Kingdom. And as you can probably guess, it doesn't go amazingly. Briggs was actually inspired by a Panorama documentary about government contingency plans should a nuclear attack happen, and he felt they were very comically ill-equipped to keep people safe from this kind of disaster. So the idea that dystopic fiction was influenced by our culture becomes more prominent in the 2000s as we get an explosion of these, I need to stop wording things stupidly. We get an increase in movies about disasters and, apocalyptic events. I wonder what occurred in the 2000s that caused people to talk about this. It seems like something I should never forget. One of the more recent things in the 2010s were kind of a rise in YA fiction that looked at tyrannical leaders being overthrown by small cadres, your Hunger Gameses, your Divergences. This seems to be somewhat inspired by the Harry Potter books, which looked at themes of control and rebellion. However, one could argue that YA novels like The Hunger Games was inspired by something a lot more emotionally turbulent, at least before the wizard lady was revealed to be an absolute ball bag, and that was the tail end of the Bush administration.
When The Hunger Games was released in 2008, the US was already involved in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, which affected the people's trust in government. In polls conducted by the Pew Research Center asking about the level of trust that US citizens have in their government, the results showed that since 2007, the share saying that they could trust the government always or most of the time has not surpassed 30%. The polls also show that in 2008, the year that The Hunger Games was published, public trust in government was at 24%. In 2011, when Legend was published, trust in government was down to 17%. In his book on The Hunger Games, Tom Henthorne suggests that the reason the novel received such popular response was due to the time it was published.
The mood of the time shaped its reception. The book's biting irony matched the mood of the times, as a population which was weary of the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and suspicious of its political leaders, faced a very real prospect of economic ruin.
So with trust of the government being at an all-time low, maybe it's time to, get out those money-churning YA adaptations and later movie releases. Just time for easy catharsis. In stark contrast to how dark dystopic fiction got eventually. And with my comically oversimplified overview of how apocalyptic fiction has kind of evolved over time, you must be getting to wonder yourself, man, with how much we've talked about the end of the world in the last half century, it's weird that it just hasn't happened yet. Well, and I hope this isn't too gauche, but perhaps it already has. Now let's talk about the movies this video is supposed to be about.
It's Christmas at Ground Zero, there's music in the air.
So dystopia is not a new theme for a Christmas fair. Rather famously, there's Christmas at Ground Zero by Weird Al Yankovic. And again, I will notice that out of the 3 films to talk about, only one of them is an actual Christmas movie. The other 2 just happened to be released around Christmas, and I gotta wonder why. And the answer, dear viewers, is probably Oscars. One of the qualifying categories to be nominated for an Oscar is that it has to be playing in a major US city like LA in the calendar period of the year that they want to be nominated for. Now, this doesn't mean the movie has to come out in December. But believe it or not, there's actually precedent for it having a decent effect on an Oscar movie success if it's released later in the year, especially on December time. It gives you more way of winning an Oscar.
Broadly speaking, the relationship between a movie's release date and Oscar bona fides has progressed through 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 lasted for roughly the first half century of the Oscars. During this stretch, no single release date pattern emerged. The number varied by year, but about half the winners in the big 4 awards categories went to movies with release dates from January through September, and half went to movies with release dates from October through December. For every Lawrence of Arabia released in 1962, there was a Godfather, March 1972. By the late 1970s, though, that balance began to tilt, until not a single one of the 20 big 4 awards from 1987 through 1991 went to a movie with a pre-October release. Dead Poets Society and Goodfellas, for instance, were 2 pre-October releases that lost Best Picture during the span. Movies from the first 9 months of the year have been Oscar surprises more than stalwarts ever since. They've won only 2 of the past 20 Big 4 prizes. Kate Blanchett for Blue Jasmine, released in July 2013, and the aforementioned asterisked Julianne Moore for Still Alice, and haven't won more than 7 of 20 since 1997 to 2001. As movies with an earlier release date waned in the Academy's consciousness, Christmastime movies thrived. From 1986 through 2005, half the Best Picture winners had a release date of December 15th or later, and 35 of 80 Big 4 winners overall, 43.8%, belonged to movies with so late a release. The Christmas rush yielded a majority of the top-line winners in 1986, 1989, 1990, 1994, 1998, and each year from 2002 to 2005. Studios flooded that sliver of the calendar with their best Oscar bait, creating a self-fulfilling set of circumstances. With the most qualified movies receiving a late December release, those weeks were more likely to produce Oscar winners, thereby reaffirming their attraction, and so on.
So for the sake of transparency, this article is a few years old now, and the Oscars have actually gone through a bit of changes, and something it actually notes is that because the date of the actual ceremony has been pushed up a bit, actually releasing movies in October and November are a better chance of you getting the Oscar buzz in terms of the build up to it, and they kind of run to the Oscars, all that crap. But none of this is an exact science, and it gives Netflix an excuse to like plop their movies very shortly after they release them into theaters in order to be Oscar potential, because streaming a film is still not considered candidate for an Oscar. It has to be theatrically run. And Netflix really stubbornly refused to release their film theatrically for long enough runs because they hate money. And if you want to hear more about this, where would it appear, I guess? It's the video from the Coconut Guy. You should watch it.
Consider the coconut.
Oh, God, okay. For continuity, I opened my jacket. Really keeping you up to date with the exciting stuff happening in this video. Anyway, this kind of goes forward to saying why a topical apocalypse film like Don't Look Up was released onto cinemas, I think it was around early December, and eventually released onto their streaming platform on Christmas Eve 2021. And then went on to be the second most watched Netflix movie in the platform's history. I can't say for certain that this was Netflix strategy for it to be an Oscar contender, but it clearly worked as it was nominated for 4 Oscars, didn't win any, but... So then we get another very topical movie that is directed by the guy who did Marriage Story, which was also an Oscar hopeful, and maybe this is why they decided to go with this again. So it actually got released in November 25th after its premiere in Venice. That premiere was in August for sake of timeline. And then it finally got released, actually a couple of days after Christmas, which was December 30th. Still around the Christmas time, so my point still stands. And while it was not nominated for any Oscars, it did get into the for your consideration campaign. Hell, I honestly think this is why the Coleman film I mentioned at the start of the video is also being released around December, because, you know, they could probably try pushing her for an Oscar contender for however she does in that film. Though again, I think she's probably going to be more taken for The Bike Riders, which is a really good film, you should watch it out. I'm getting distracted. So there you go. These films were likely released as a marketing strategy to try to win Oscars, and not really because there's some connection between Christmas and apocalypse. I've completely wasted your time in this video. Goodbye. But I do think these films coming around roughly the same time, dealing with certain themes of the pandemic, accidentally for a lot of these cases, is actually really interesting that, again, they all come around December. A Thorough White Noise, which is at least like the other two, and again, the novel was released in the 80s, and this movie had actually been in pre-production for like years. This movie deals a lot with self-delusion and the apathy and the goings-on in the world that adults kind of put themselves into in this kind of comfortable abode until it comes up and bites them in the ass, like the case with the gas cloud in this film. This is particularly potent with our leads, Hitler Studies professor Jack Gladney and housewife Babette. Both of them are terrified of dying and now are forced to confront that. We have the awkwardness when they attempt to move back to normalcy once the gas cloud thing passes, and the children are a lot more aware than the adults of the disasters that are coming along, which feels like a dystopia in the waiting. Unlike the other two films, this has a lot of relevancy to the pandemic. The movie ends with Jack still facing a slow but inevitable death, so say we all, and Babette hopefully moving past her drug dependency that was fueled by these fears. We get closing lines about how, despite the fact that they played a part in their own destruction, they will face this together as a unified front. It's a strangely bittersweet note, and leaves you wondering if all they've learned is to take care of each other rather than pay attention or listen to their children's clearly startling fears. There's also a dance in the supermarket, which goes back into the themes from the 80s book, and, you know, shows how we have a wonderful distraction all in together as a front. It's very cynical, but has a twinge of hope. Silent Night is our actually film that's set on Christmas, in this Christmas watching, but again, we live in a post-Die Hard world. Anything can be a Christmas movie, you watch it over Christmas. Please let this be a post-Die Hard world. Nobody cares, Frank, that you watched the film, even though it's not like other Christmas movies. Watch it, go, hey, no one cares about your habits. It's a rather intimate film where the vast majority of it is set place over a day, and it's all about these couples who are in this one location together, this house, rather large house. I get the vibe of Peter's friends, but there's more oddities and strange things and like kind of portentous stuff the characters keep bringing up, until it very bluntly displays to you that there's a gaseous cloud coming that will kill them all by the start of midnight, and they are all planning to take suicide pills, which have been provided to them by the British government. If they don't, they'll be meeting a rather grisly and horrible end. Like Don't Look Up, this looks at the cause and effects that led the world to reach this point. Unlike Don't Look Up, this feels a lot more internalized and self-critical. These people are wealthy, and this movie has a lot of antipathy for them, except for Roman Griffin Davies of Jojo Rabbit fame and Lily Rose Depp's characters. The rest of them are trapped in their bourgeois bubble, still to the end trying to ignore the realities of what's about to happen. Compounding this, we find out that the unhoused and the undocumented are not given these pills, so they are just left to suffer and die painfully. It's something David's character brings up and is very visibly upset over. None of the other characters are, because they'd rather live in their self-delusion rather than face their complicity at the end of the world. This makes this critique a lot more focused and harder hitting than the other ones of these climate change based apocalypse movies, though I think the director might disagree with me because she showed support for Don't Look Up on Twitter. And this is heavy on. It even name drops Greta Thunberg at one point. It's a shame that coming out during COVID kind of undermines this how it feels, especially with everyone, the fact that they're locked within this house and they're technically not trapped in the house. There's too many of them to be kind of a more direct, stay at home kind of parallel. But again, that feeling is there, at least for me. Point is, this film is not subtle and it's very scathing. We end with all of them dying, except maybe implied Davies survives, meaning that, you should be critical of the government's message. And this is an awkward place post-COVID because you could read it as an anti-vaxxer film. Thank you, Hoots, for never making me not see this film in this way ever again. Ultimately, it comes down to we have taken in our creature comforts and compliance to social order, and this has led to our doom. No matter what interpretation you take from the very final shot. And despite my tone here, I actually quite enjoyed this film. It's got an emotional rawness that the others don't really have. It makes it a lot more compelling to me. And finally, Don't Look Up. Point up. You shouldn't look there. I'm not really going to argue about this film's merits as a satire for climate disaster. I've been there, I got involved, it got boring. My friend Sarah did a breakdown of this roughly around the time the movie came out because she's a lot better at hitting at topical things way sooner. Like a real YouTuber maybe. What I will say is that it got a lot of people talking, I mean a lot. A lot of people who defend this film brought up the fact that scientists really backed it. The thing is, the scientists come out looking the best out of every group that's focused on in this film. They have some flaws, like one example is they're not very good communicators, which doesn't help the end of the world. But I think it struck a chord how frustrating it is to get people to listen to the science, especially around this time, because this was like late 2021. So a lot of vaccine denialism was around this time. A lot of people love to listen to the experts, except when it's counter to their desires and biases. Well, it's difficult to get an exact number for this. Studies have estimated that roughly 230,000 people died from COVID that could have prevented through vaccination. So yeah, if a scientist found this cathartic, I'm not going to judge. However, this movie is deeply, deeply pessimistic towards humanity and our ability to combat it. While framed as a cautionary tale, what I took away from this is no matter what we do to beg the government to do something, plead with people to listen to us, scream at the media to report this kind of stuff accurately, we are just basically inevitably going into our disasters and the end of our lives because of the systems that are put up in place.
We really did have everything, didn't we?
There is a grain of truth there. Hell, there's a grain of truth to all these films. And this appears to be the apocalyptic fiction trend of the 2020s that is kind of awkwardly bumped into Christmastime, not really through fault of their own, but still this is kind of what's happened. And that is this kind of smug doomerism and chastising people for how we got here. Anyway, this is why I find this fatalism trend bollocks.
And what have you done?
The joy of these videos taking forever for me is that when I initially kind of did this, my plan was to talk about how we're kind of looking for more hopeful fiction in our blockbusters, like on films that were successful, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, but also The Way of Water and Top Gun Maverick. Then one of the highest grossing movies of this year is about a man's hubris, about the cause of, you guessed it, the end of the world. I think Oppenheimer operates a little differently from the three films I've been talking about. Going into that would probably take too long for the scope of this video. But it looks like more of a tunnel vision examination of the hows and whys of how people got here, rather than a broad overview of how they ignored it until the inevitable happened. And I glanced over the three films I talked about. I didn't really go into that much depth because I was more looking at how these things kind of coalesce to get off a general feeling and idea of how people kind of get into this mindset and how it seems to be reflective of how people are kind of looking at the world right now. In fact, I made another video that's very similar to this about social media trends and how they influence film. This is a bit of a different tangent to that, but again, here. And I need to stress this, if you watch bleak or nihilistic films over Christmas, or whatever winter holiday you celebrate or lack thereof. This is very Christmas focused and very US and UK focused, I'm aware, because it's based a lot on my own experiences and how Christmas trends tend to evolve over time in media. I don't, but the point is, if you watch these films over the winter holidays, that's fine. And if that's something that helps you get some sort of joy, go ahead. And this is my point. It should bring you joy. It should bring you comfort. It shouldn't really bring you feelings of spiraling dread and nihilistic. The American Psychiatric Association estimated that around 5% of adults in the US have seasonal anxiety disorder or SAD. And honestly, that figure is probably way low because not a lot of people get actually diagnosed with SAD or go in and get an actual diagnosis. So that number could be a lot higher. And again, a lot of the way people feel shit about December is that there's a lot of bullshit build up towards these holidays. Christmas in particular, there's a want and desire to make, build it up in your head, and reality can never match that, and that it can be very dispiriting. Not to mention the cost of it now, and people struggling to make ends meet. And my suggestion here isn't to fit into your comfortable bubble and ignore all the problems during the season, because that's crap and I know it. You know it. There are kids dying in genocide campaigns right now, and they will not be having a very happy holiday. People die of preventable means, not just pandemic, but food insecurity, homelessness, mental health stuff, being targeted for their minority status. We witness all this, and we see this happening while we waste away on encroaching fascistic states. You should be angry. You should be furious. You have a right to, but it will eat at you, especially with everything working towards making you feel as miserable and powerless as possible. And watching fucking movies telling you that it's impossible to get over this encroaching climate crisis. Yeah, it doesn't really help us be productive. It just helps us be angry. And no matter how justified it is, if all you feel and do is anger, it just leaves you feeling hurt. I watched a movie a few weeks back called So This Is Christmas. It's directed by Ken Wardrobe. He's an Irish filmmaker who's done a lot of documentaries. They're structured in this kind of wonderful human interest way where he takes a topic and interviews several people and just examines them as it goes on. This one, he was looking into the modern struggles of Christmas. Two of the stories that stood out to me was a woman who had recently separated and she's struggling to, make her children's Christmas feel special. And a man who, with his two young children, has to face the first Christmas since his wife passed away. At one point, a woman breaks down and talks about Christmases she used to have as a child and how she cannot provide that same experience for her own children. And it reminds me of traditions, the rituals, the things you do every year that gives you comfort in that familiarity, that repetition. So, one of the most profound moments is right near the end of the film, where the man who lost his wife is talking about what he feels Christmas is about. It's about time. Time is the greatest present you can give or receive in this world. The last time I saw my dad alive was Christmas Eve. And he loved holidays. He had his own traditions that he did every year, doing the rounds, visiting his family. That's when we tended to see him during that day. It's Christmas Eve. One of the things that always stuck with me is his mom, my grandmother, used to make him bacon and stuffing, bacon and cabbage, and the man could have a fucking 3-course meal and he would devour that entire thing. No matter what he did, he always just went there and he just ate, just scarfed down his mother's cooking, just properly horsed it down. And it's a stupid tradition to stick in my mind, my father eating habit. And I'm telling you, you do not realize how important these traditions are until they are gone. Because it's not about the traditions. It's not. I remember once saying that Christmas didn't feel very special to my other grandmother, my mom's mom. And she got really into overboard trying to get everything very festive for me, like bring out jigsaw puzzles and stuff like that. One of the things is like, I was in my late 20s at this time. I'm in my early 30s now. And like, you can't capture that feeling of Christmas anymore unless you have children yourself and experience it through them. And that's fine. You know, people get older. Their priorities change. They're not as, willing to get into the festive season as they used to. And it's hard to get into that, especially as you get older and realize the difficulties around it. It's just part of growing up. And I think this is why this line stuck out to me, because we don't have a lot of time left. And with the little time I have that, I want to experience it with the people in my life, the ones that matter, the ones that mean something to me, like my family. Not getting into this, as this news is more rather recent. My father has been gone for a long time, but another Christmas tradition has ended this year. And it just reminds me more that all we have is time. And I'd rather, keep those memories to me, because they keep me grounded as we stand on the crevice of a mushroom cloud. This stuff should be important to you too. And not just if it's Christmas, because, forget about the holiday thing. Even just in winter, just in general, just for winter time, it's difficult to get into the positive attitude towards something, because it's just hard. It's difficult. And what I want to say to you throughout all this is, you deserve much more for yourself than living in this kind of despair. Part of wanting to heal the world is not just about getting angry or aggressive and getting into shouting matches on social media, as much as those people are wrong and awful. This isn't good for you. Part of it should be about helping yourself as well as helping everyone around you. Realizing why you're doing this is part of the fight. I go back to the community episode. If you haven't seen it, part of what happened with Ovid is that he's gone into this kind of delusional state because his mom cancelled their Christmas plans, which was a tradition for him. At near the end of the episode, his community, his new family, the study group, come in to help him and bring up his spirit by creating new traditions.
The delusion you're trying to cure is called Christmas, Duncan.
It's the crazy notion that the longest, coldest, darkest nights can be the warmest and brightest.
Thanks, Lost. Maybe you think the holidays are shit, and you're probably right. But hey, I still have those specials and those films. That means something to me. That's probably sad as it is, to be honest. But I think it's because they keep me happy and grounded in a really dark time. And hell, you can remove the religious shit or all that baggage if you want, because, films are very secular in nature. There are religious films. You get my point. Like, the first Christmas film was about fucking Santa Claus. They can help, even for one day, to not make me sink into misery and remind me of who I love and why I love them and why I love myself and why you should love yourself. Traditions that keep going, or the new ones I can make with those in my life. Because otherwise, it's just easier to give up. Part of this is to break the doomerism notions around stuff like climate change and the end of the world. I've already mentioned Kyle's video, but another one I want to bring up is one by Zoe B. She looks into apocalyptic thinking, and she does a great job at dispelling the kind of myths that people build around it and showing you a better, healthier way of maintaining this overview while still looking at the stuff that happens within the world that could lead to these kind of destructive behaviors. It's got great references, and it's got really good tips of avoiding this fatalistic outlook. It's got great resources to look into a better way of thinking and helping. It's a really great video. It does bring up the question, probably not for you, but definitely for me, is there a positive spin you can put on the end of the world? Well, depends what time it is. For now, however, it's more important to fight against fatalist thinking and sliding into the idea that you're helpless. So to paraphrase another favourite special of mine, it's just some random guys towards the dark night before Christmas. Hey, remember that guy? Merry Christmas, or however you celebrate wintertime, to all. Well, at least for tonight. 'Twas Christmas Eve, babe, in the drunk tank. An old man said to me, won't see another one. And then he sang a song, the rare old Mountain Dew. I turned my face away and dreamed about you. Got on the lucky one, came in 18 to 1. I've got a feeling this year's for me and you. So happy Christmas. I love you, baby. I can see a better time when all our dreams come true. They've got cars big as bars, they've got rivers of gold, but the wind runs right through you, it's no place for the old. When they first took my hand on a cold Christmas Eve, you promised me Broadway was waiting for me. You were handsome, you were pretty, Queen of New York City. When the band finished playing, they howled out for more. Sinatra was swinging, all the drunks they were singing. We kissed on a corner and danced through the night. And the boys from the NYPD choir were singing Galway Bay. And the bells were ringing out for Christmas Day.